The topic of this video is elasticities in economics, and we will talk about what elasticities are, which elasticities we usually deal with, how elasticities can be computed, and what the economic interpretation of an elasticity is. In economics, we are often confronted with the question how one variable changes in response to the change of another variable. So for example, if the price of a certain good changes, how much does its consumption change? That would be the elasticity of demand with respect to a change in the price. So the price elasticity of demand that we are interested in. Or another question, what happens if incomes rise? How much does the demand for different goods change in this situation? In the example that we have here, the good in question is education. So if incomes rise, people can afford more of the different goods, but the different goods will be affected differently. You do not buy twice as much bread if your income doubles, but perhaps you may increase the demand for a certain luxury good by even more than 100% if your income doubles. And that is the income elasticity of demand that we are interested in this case. Or in the third example, we may ask the question how the demand for one good, in this case for solar panels, reacts when the price of another good changes, in this case electricity. So that would be that we are interested in the cross elasticity of demand. So if the price of one good changes, how does the demand for the other good react? And of course, we can also be interested in changes to supply if prices change. So the last example here would be the price elasticity of supply. So if the price of construction rises, for example, how does this affect the number of newly built houses? The problem that we usually face in this context is, of course, that we deal with different units in case of the questions that we just asked. So we cannot compare the results easily. To illustrate this in a more concrete way, consider the following three examples that are related to the price elasticity of demand. So the question how the demand for a certain good changes if its price changes. In the first example, we consider apples. So if their price rises by €1, how many fewer apples would be sold? The second is, if the price of oranges rises by €1, how many fewer oranges are sold? And this already makes clear that we are comparing apples and oranges literally as an outcome. And we cannot really compare this because it's not the same unit of measurement. And for example 3, it's even clearer. There we say, how does the average price of cars, how does the average demand for cars changes if their price rises by €1? And perhaps nothing would change in this case if their price changes by €1 because cars are just in a very different price range than apples and oranges. So we are literally comparing apples and oranges with cars in this example, and that means that the outcomes are not comparable whatsoever. So it makes no sense to compare the outcome and say, well, the first good, apples, react more to the price than, say, cars react to the price, because we are just not comparing the same units. How can we overcome this problem? Here the central idea comes in that we should not compare absolute units in terms of price changes and quantity changes, but percentage changes. And that leads to the definition of elasticities, where an elasticity measures the sensitivity of one variable with respect to another variable, but in percentage terms. So the variable x changes in percentage terms due to a response of a 1% change in variable y. So from a mathematical perspective, the elasticity of the good x with respect to a change in y, which may be the price of good x or the price of another good z, or it may be income, can be measured as the change in the quantity of good x divided by the level of good X that is sold, so that's the percentage change in the quantity of X, divided by the percentage change in the quantity of Y, which can be the price, for example. Then we would have the price change here divided by the price level before. So then we have the percentage change in the quantity in the numerator and the percentage change in the price in case of the price elasticity of demand in the denominator. That is if the change that we are observing is discrete. But very often we deal with continuous changes, and then the counterpart of this formulation in terms of the elasticity is the derivative of x, of the quantity of x with respect to a change in y. That would be the percentage change in x divided by the percentage change in y if the change is continuous. And we will see that we can easily rewrite this as the derivative of the quantity with respect to the price multiplied by the level of y divided by the level of x. So that means we have now the same units of measurement, if you will. We are comparing percentage changes, and we can do this for apples, for oranges, and for cars. The units of measurement do not matter anymore. Now we can illustrate this with the three examples that we had before. Now in example 1, the price of apples does not change by €1, but by 1%, and we ask how many fewer apples are sold in percentage terms. The same holds true in example 2 for the price of oranges, and in example 3 for the price of cars. And now you see immediately the difference between examples 1 and 2 on the one hand and example 3 on the other, because the price range of cars is just in such a different league than the price change of apples and oranges, so that we in this case assume a change in the price of 1%, and 1% of the price of a car is much more in absolute terms than 1% of the price of oranges and apples. So a 1% increase in the price of cars may really have an effect on the number of cars sold. And this was not so if the price of cars changes by €1 as before. So now in these cases, in all of these cases, the outcome is measured in percentage terms and the price change is measured in percentage terms. So now the units of measurement in absolute terms do not matter anymore, and we can easily compare the results of the elasticities between examples 1, 2, and 3. And this is important because that allows us now to judge whether the demand for certain goods is more or less elastic, for example, to a change in the price, as it is done in these examples here. In general, we then have the following cases as they are specified here, where we focus on the positive elasticities, but the case of negative elasticities follows analogously. So in this case, we would have that if epsilon is greater than 1, then the good x is elastic with respect to a change in y. It means that if y changes by 1%, then good x, or the demand of good x, would change by more than 1%. And that means it's elastic. By contrast, if epsilon is smaller than 1, then x changes by less in percentage terms than the change in y. So if this is the demand of good x, then if the price changes by 1%, demand for good x would change by less than 1%, which means that it is inelastic with respect to a change in y. Then the border case where epsilon is equal to 1, then we say that x is unit elastic with respect to a change in y, which means that if y changes by 1%, then the demand of x also changes by 1%. So there is a one-to-one change basically. And then there are two polar cases. If epsilon goes to infinity, that would mean that x is perfectly elastic with respect to a change in y. For example, again, if this is demand for good x, and this is the price, then a slight increase in the price would lead to a situation that nobody demands the good X anymore. And this could be, for example, in a perfectly competitive market, if one seller wants to raise the price, but all the other sellers stay lower with the price, then the person who raises the price, or the seller who raises the price, would not be able to sell anything anymore of the certain good that it sells. And if epsilon is equal to 0, then x is completely unresponsive to changes in y. In this case, we would say that x is perfectly inelastic with respect to y. So if this is again demand for good x, and this is a price change, then we have that if the seller changes the price, demand stays the same. That could be, for example, if the seller is a monopolist and the good that is purchased is a necessary good, so that people need it to survive or whatever. In this case, a price change would not affect demand at all. I've already mentioned it throughout this video that there are different types of elasticities, but now let's link them again explicitly to the examples that we had at the beginning, where the first one was an example for the price elasticity of demand, which means how the demand of one good changes if its price changes. The second was an example for the income elasticity of demand, so how demand changes if incomes rise. The third one was the cross elasticity of demand, so if the price of one good rises, how is the demand for the good that we are interested in change? And finally, we had the price elasticity of supply. If the price of construction changes, how then does the number of newly built houses change? And in the following videos, I will focus on these different elasticities, how they are computed, and I will give examples for the computation and for the interpretation. Thank you very much for watching the video, and I hope you found it interesting and useful. For more videos on economic content, please visit my channel that you find here to the left. And to the right, you see the next video in the series at the top, and at the bottom, you see the whole lecture in the form of a playlist.